rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice, right? That's Philippians, which is kind of called the book of joy. In Romans, may the God of all hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, so by the power of the Holy Spirit you may abound in hope. In James, he says, count it all joy, my brothers, right, when you meet trials of various kinds. And then Galatians, right, the fruit of the Spirit. The fruit of the Spirit is love and joy and peace and patience and kindness. And Jesus says, many different times, but he says, I've spoken these things that my joy may be in you, right, and that your joy may be complete. And joy comes all through the Bible, right? Joy starts at the very beginning. What is the very first thing we see in Genesis? And I think I've got a slide for this one. I'm going to have to tell you when to switch slides, because, Right, in the very beginning, God creates the world, he says it's good, right? And we take joy in that. We take joy in the things that we have. And if you read through the Old Testament, especially through the Psalms, when they talk about joy, kind of through there's joy in your family, there's joy in your friends, there's joy in your flocks, right? There's all these different things that are good that we take joy in. And this all starts with this, and God saw that it was good and what he made, and we take joy in this. And it's and in our circumstances, in the place in the life that we find ourselves in, we find joy. And there is joy in that. That's a part of joy. Right? If you on Christmas morning is joyful. Why? Because you're together with your family. You have time off, you're giving and receiving gifts. Right? It's a joyful time. Sometimes good things happen at work, or good things happen in life. If you get married and that's a joyful time, or you have a baby, that's a joyful time. All these different things. These are all good things, and these are all part of the world and part of things that bring us joy, for sure, in our circumstances, right? And that is a part of joy, but there's other sides to joy. But through the Bible, it starts off with joy, but even then, Israel ends up in slavery, and they end up in Egypt. Not quite so joyful, not so much the joy in the circumstances, but then God brings along Moses, and he pulls them out of, right? He pulls them out of slavery. And where do they end up? Not quite the promised land yet. They end up in the desert for how long? Right? About 40 years. Right? Not really joyful per se. And yet it's in that, and if you read through Exodus, especially, there's this continuous theme. And I know there was a lot of grumbling and complaining as well, but there was also these songs of worship, of praise and of joy, because they found joy even in the midst of this, even in the midst of the desert. Not exactly a wonderful place to be. But there was something that brought them joy that wasn't just their circumstances. Their circumstances weren't so wonderful, but there was something that brought them joy. And what was that thing that brought them joy? It's where they were going, right? It was their destination. Even though getting out of Egypt was amazing, and there's joy in that, and this joyful procession out. But then in the desert, there's no food, and there's no water, and there's it's not exactly a safe place to be, and they're there for a long time. But there's something that continued to give them joy. And again, not every day, not all the time, they struggled. But this overall sense of joy, and it was the place that they were going to. God had promised and said, I'm going to give you this promised land. I'm going to take you to this place. And so they found joy in that. Joy was in their future destination, right? Joy was in this place that they could think about. And they'd actually seen it, sort of, right? A few of them had seen it, but they could kind of see it, but they certainly knew about it. They could kind of, and they were waiting, right? They were waiting. And there's this sense of, I was going to show a video. I'm not going to show it right now, because that's what crashed the computer this morning. I'll show it a little bit later, I think, because it's worth it. It's worth crashing the computer 2 minutes before church starts for this clip. But we'll show it in a little bit. And so we have the story, and again, Luke. We have the story of Luke. And as we just heard about Zechariah and Elizabeth, again, they have no children, right? They have no children. And to not have children in this culture is a big deal. Right? In our culture, lots of people, they just choose. I don't even want children. I don't even want to get married. If I do get married, I don't even want to have children. It's really not a big deal at all. But in this culture, to not have children, it meant God, basically, God had cursed you. Had not blessed you in this way, then God had cursed you, and it's super shameful. It was a really hard thing. And again, they don't understand science. They don't understand genetics. So they just think this is God's curse upon them, God taking away his hand of blessing. And so it's just a hard thing. And not only that, and these aren't just regular people. He's a priest. He's giving his life to the work of God, and still no children. And now they're old, so it's not like they're kind of hoping. Now they're past the time of being able to have kids. And so they're living in this culture which is shameful, literally living with shame, living with this thought that God has taken away his hand of blessing. And not only that, they also have the oppression of Rome too, right? They have all of these different things. And this is where the angel meets them, and it's in chapter 1. And so again, as you read the story, and as the angel comes, we're just kind of used to this story, but try and picture in your mind what it's like to not have children, to be way past the time of children. And again, children represented this whole thing. It represented a future and a destiny and passing on your name and land and name and this legacy was such a big part of Jewish culture and the Israel culture because it meant God was with you and to pass those. So to not be able to have children, especially a boy, sorry to the ladies, but if you didn't have a boy, you couldn't pass on your name. If you couldn't pass on your name, it meant like your land couldn't pass on. It was a big, big deal. And so this is what they're living under. And so when he's working, Zechariah is working, and he's working on a thing, and one day, this is verse 8 of chapter 1 of Luke, it says, one day Zechariah was serving God in the temple, for his order was on duty that week, and it was in the custom of the priest. He was chosen by lot to enter the sanctuary to burn incense in the Lord's presence. While the incense was being burned, a great crowd, they all stood outside. And then Zechariah was in the sanctuary when an angel of the Lord appeared, standing to the right of the incense altar. And Zechariah was overwhelmed with fear, but the angel said, don't be afraid, Zechariah, for God has heard your prayer, and your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son. And you are to name him John, and you will have great joy and gladness, and many will rejoice with you at his birth, for he will be great in the eyes of the Lord. And he goes on to tell how John's going to be a part of this. But the first words is, first, don't be afraid. And, we always think cute little fat baby angels, right? But the biblical angels have like weird eyes and floating wings. And I saw one guy put one on top of his Christmas tree this year, and I'm like, that's just creepy. That's going to freak out your kids, that's for sure. But he comes, he says, don't be afraid. It's pretty normal. But then was the second he says, I've got, I'm about to tell you something that you're going to have great joy. It's going to bring you gladness. And again, in all these ways, because not only are they living under Roman oppression, not only do they not have children living under kind of the shame culture of that, but they've also been told their entire life they're waiting for redemption, they're waiting for a Messiah, and they're getting older. So they're past childbearing, but they're also going to die at some point soon. And they haven't seen the Messiah. So they're living with all of this, and the angel shows up in one small sentence. He says, you're gonna have great joy. Why? Because I'm going to take away the shame of not having children. Such a huge thing for that culture. Not only that, not only are you going to see the Redeemer, not only are you going to be kind of see this just as as part of Israel, but you're going to be a part of this story. Your son is going to play a role in this story. And so to go from where he was and to go and within that one visit for the angel, this is a pretty amazing. So he says when great joy comes, he's not kidding. He's not kidding. Now, as soon as he says you're going to have great joy, Rome didn't go away, and it still took another 9 months for them to have a child, and then John had to grow up for 20 years, whatever it was John was going to be. Do we know how old John was? I have no idea. Somebody can Google it. I don't know. Well, I guess if Jesus was, maybe he's only a couple months younger than Jesus. Yeah. But I don't know when he started being a prophet, though, right? I think he started before Jesus. So this is great news. Because he went from here and God brought him here and he said, some things are going to change here, but there's something else. This Redeemer is going to come. We don't know about, again, in their minds, always redemption means out from under the oppression of Rome. And of course, that doesn't happen. But the angel comes and he says, you're going to have great joy. You're going to have, and not just you, but all the people will have joy because of this. And so he takes them from being very much less than, and he says, this is what's going to come through joy. And then he goes to the shepherds. The shepherds, again, as we heard this morning, the shepherds are the lowliest of the low. They're kind of the scum, and you put them out in the fields and you say no one cares. And they're out there. It's not a good job. Nobody wants this job, right? It's like living in air. No one wants to live in air. No, I'm just kidding. Kidding. Is anybody here from air? Hopefully not. My tires will be flat after this. Yeah. He comes to these people, and again, they are less than. They live not only under the shame of being oppressed by Rome, but also the shame of kind of just being the bottom of their own society. And it's to them that God sends the angels. And what does he say to them? He says the exact same thing. These are people, they'd be younger, so they haven't passed that age bracket yet of, not seeing but they're at the bottom. So many things about life, and they come, and what is the first message that the angels say to them? We have good news of what? Great joy. Now, did Rome disappear that night? No. Again, did it take another 30 years for Jesus to grow up and begin his ministry? Yes, it did. And then 3 years later, they're putting him on a cross. What is going on? So the circumstances hadn't changed, but the angel's not lying when he says, you have great joy because something is going to happen. Right? And it's just like Israel. Yeah, you're still in the desert, but there's something that is coming, and that is what gives us joy. That is what pulls us forward. That is what pushes us forward. Now again, when Jesus shows up, major disappointment. He's a massive disappointment. Why? Everybody gets excited. Everybody gets pretty jazzed about this guy. Again, not the first person to be thought to be the Messiah, and they're pretty excited for this. And then he shows up and he says things like, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, do good to those who do bad things to you. That's who will be blessed. That's not exactly the answer. People, when they celebrate his birth and they need to wait 30 years, are like, this is going to be the guy. And once he hits that age, he's going to pick up the sword, he's going to gather an army, and we are good to go. And instead, he's preaching love and this hippy-dippy stuff. And you know it's a disappointment because some of his own people, one of his closest followers, well, they turn him in. They're like, this is not who I thought he was going to be. He's not doing the things that I thought the Messiah was going to do. Until after his death and his resurrection. And then they begin to look anew and then go, oh, wait a minute. When we heard about great news, good news of great joy. Zechariah, he'd be long dead by now, but when he was told, right, of what John was going to do, and the person who would follow John, not what he thought. Not bringing freedom from Rome, but in fact, bringing something so much greater. Not just freedom from Rome. Rome, all empires fall at some point. But he brought freedom from sin. And what is the wages of sin? Again, the wages of sin is death. It's freedom from death. It's freedom from death. But they don't understand this until after the resurrection. They don't actually understand this until Jesus himself, for some of them, comes along and has to explain it to them and say, actually, the good news of great joy is not freedom from Rome, it's freedom from death. All we had to look forward to was death. All the Psalms about Sheol and what it means to just be separated from God. He goes, but no longer. No longer will be separated. This is the joy that we find. And when Jesus preaches about this, he's doing what Israel, he's saying, listen, there is still a promised land. Yes, whatever you're going through right now, not perfect, not great, in all these different ways, depending on who they were. But there's good news of great joy, and that's that you no longer have to face death. Your circumstances right now are maybe not going to change. Maybe you're still struggling. The thing that we celebrate in the death and the resurrection of Jesus is what? It's that God said, listen, what we're going to do is we're going to love the world. And I'm going to send my son out of love. And what he's going to do, he's going to give his life to take away and to defeat sin and defeat death. And then through his resurrection, through the defeat of all of that, we now offer you life. And what we rejoice in at Christmas time is we rejoice that the love of God, it overcame death. The love of God overcame death. Every single person ever lived, we're all going to die. We're all going to face death. That's just part of life. And no matter if you're rich, no matter if you're poor, no matter if you struggle, no matter if life is amazing, we all face death, right? Death and taxes, the only two things you're guaranteed. The good news of Christmas, the good news of God sending himself, the good news of coming as Christ, as Jesus, to give his life. That the love of God overcame death. And this is what we celebrate. This is why we celebrate Christmas. If Jesus was a good guy who taught us some good things, kind of like Gandhi and a whole bunch of other people and the Dalai Lama is a good guy and he teaches some good things. Right? But Jesus is not the Dalai Lama and Jesus is not Gandhi. Right? And they're both wonderful people in their own rights and they teach wonderful things in their own rights. But that's not the good news of great joy for us. It wasn't for Israel and it wasn't for us. It's not moralism. It's not how to be good people. It's that the love of God has defeated death and that every single person no longer has to see death. If we give our life to Christ, if we put our faith in that love that God exhibited, then we have a life after this. Just like Israel walking through the desert, you see, you might be in the desert, but we have something that we look forward to, and it's a joy that sustains us. Because the thing about joy is we can find joy in our circumstances, but as Christians, we also have a joy in where we are going. We have a joy in the truth that is bigger than this world. Again, Paul talks about, our struggles in this world. It's not against flesh, and, we have our own struggles, but there's a bigger reality to this world. And one day when that veil drops away, right, and we're in the upside down, as some people call it, right, all of a sudden, that's gone, and what do we see? We see the reality, and that reality is that we are already living in eternity, even now. If you're a Christian, right, we're already living that eternity. We have to go through this life. But when Christ comes back or when we die, we find ourselves in the presence of God. And we find ourselves in the promised land. And what a wonderful thing this is. And Matthew, Jesus himself says this. He says, God blesses those who are persecuted for doing right, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Again, this is his, the sermon. He says, God blesses you when people mock you and persecute you. and lie about you and say all sorts of evil things against you because you are my followers. But he says, be happy about it. In fact, be very glad, be joyful, for great is your reward in heaven. Great is your reward in heaven. Whatever you face in this world, be happy about it. You can handle this. Why? Because great is your reward. My version says, for a great reward awaits you in heaven. What a wonderful thing to look forward to. Something that anchors us, something that we look forward to, something that keeps us moving forward. When we put our faith and our trust in God's love, we have a great reward that we can look forward to. Now here's the thing. I don't know about you, but we may not all struggle and face hardships, right? Maybe life is okay. Maybe we live in a pretty good country. Right? We don't have war, we don't have tyranny, we don't have our government trying to overthrow us, we don't have rebels trying to overthrow them, we don't have other countries trying to attack us. We don't have these things. Our life is pretty good. Everybody's good with that, right? I understand personally some of us are going through things that are harder, but in general, we don't live with something. And sometimes being told, when Paul says rejoice, again I say rejoice, sometimes for some people it's actually really hard to hear that. When I hear that, I go, yeah, my life's actually really, really good. My life's actually really good. And so I say rejoice. Yeah, perfect. It's easy for me to rejoice. But there are people in this world who I think when they're told you need to be joyful and you need to rejoice, it's actually really hard. I think it just kind of adds to the guilt and the shame of actually I'm really struggling right now and life is really hard and I don't really feel joyful right now. But sometimes as Christians we're not great because when people are struggling we're like, well, you should just buck up, right? Put on a happy face. Rejoice in the Lord always. Which is a nice thing to say, but not always super helpful when people are going through really hard times. And I know what we mean, hey, like hold to God, but sometimes, that kind of dark night of the soul or just like whatever it is we're going through, sometimes when people come along and they pat you on the back and say, rejoice in the Lord always. You ever wanted to punch those people? It's not always helpful. And again, I understand the sentiment, but not always helpful. And sometimes, even when we read these passages, sometimes these passages to Zechariah, and especially to the shepherds, these aren't really passages I think that are for me in a sense of I don't know what it's like to live in a culture where not having children is like one of the most shameful things. Where your entire identity is based on if you could pass on your name. And the shame that you live for being a shepherd and being at the bottom of not only Roman society, but your own society. And so when we read these passages, again, I read them from, honestly, I don't know, what am I, middle, upper class? Probably moving down middle, lower class now with the way the world's working. But that's how I read it. I'm a white guy in Canada, Christian guy, I'm top of the rung, right? I find joy in that, right? My life is pretty easy, I'm not going to lie. There's nothing about my life that makes it hard to be me. But as we read stories about the Exodus, as we read about stories about escaping from slavery, think how you would read that when we still had, slavery in America. Imagine how you'd read that as a slave, or especially once they had freedom. How would you read that story? I think it would hit a little different. I think when you read about those struggles and you walk through those, imagine today, even as Beth shared, right? Women and children who are rescued out of sex trafficking. Imagine how they would hear these stories about the joy that Israel had in looking forward to a better life and looking forward to a promised land. I think that hits a little different. I understand at academic level, but I haven't had to go through anything. And for most of us, our lives are actually pretty good, that sometimes the talk of a wonderful life that awaits us is my life's pretty good right now. Sometimes it's hard. So sometimes when we read these stories, and especially stories of joy, sometimes it's hard for us to understand, but sometimes we see it in other people. Sometimes we find joy in other people's stories, like when Beth shares about fish, as it's called, right? And the work that's going on there, we can find joy in that. You say, actually, my life's pretty good. I find joy in that, my circumstances. And yes, I look forward to Jesus coming back, but actually sometimes we need to look around the world and go, oh, that's an amazing thing that happened, and we find joy in that thing. We find joy when other people find joy. We find joy when other people find freedom, right? We find joy when maybe we have friends or family whose marriage is struggling, and then they turn a corner and it gets better. We find joy in that. Someone who's wanted children, and then they finally have a child. We find joy in these things. We don't always have to just find joy in our own circumstances. And sometimes when life is hard and we're going through a hard time and people say rejoice, and again I say rejoice, and you're like, please get out of my house. But sometimes we can look around and say, you know what, maybe my circumstances, there's no joy right now, but we can find joy in other people's circumstances. We can find joy. We can see that God is continually moving. And one of the greatest things, right, is when we find joy when other people come to faith. There's a joy. And it's amazing, especially as adults. And again, for me at least, right, I was a teenager when I came to faith, kind of fully understanding it. Well, fully understanding it, as if I'm even close to understanding it yet. But you know what I mean, right? But it's amazing when you meet adults who find Jesus, because so many times their demeanor just changes, who they are changes, and they all of a sudden have this new joy. It's a newfound joy, and sometimes you're a little jealous of that. I always thought growing up I should have murdered people and gone to prison and then become a Christian, and I could have that story, right? I don't actually want to do any of those things, but right? But I loved hearing those stories because you could literally hear, this was my life, and then I found Jesus, and my life and there's just this joy. And not that I don't experience that joy, but I didn't have that side to compare it to. And when you hear people who come from really hard places, who come from really terrible lives, and they find Christ, it's amazing the joy that they have. I'm almost envious. I was envious growing up. I'm no longer envious because I realized how hard the hard times were, right? But how much greater is that joy in finding? And so we rejoice in those things. We rejoice in those things when we hear people's stories, when we see God working in other people's lives. Because as people of joy, we find joy in our own circumstance, and most of us, our circumstances are pretty good. We find joy in the promised future that we have. That's a wonderful truth. But as Christians, when it says rejoice, and again I say rejoice, I want your joy to be complete, Jesus says, part of that is bringing that joy to the world around us. Yes, we want it for ourselves. Yes, we experience it for ourselves. Yes, it's a joy we hold on to, but also we want to go out into this world. And we want to, right? The question is, how as Christians, right? How do we hold to a deeper joy, but how do we take that joy into the world? How do we be people who are like, one person said it, how do we be a catalyst for joy in the world around us? We sing songs about, rejoicing, especially at Christmas time, but how do we take that into a world which is still filled with a lot of darkness and a lot of pain and a lot of suffering? Right? How do we be this practical, tangible kingdom of people? Catalyst for joy. How do we do this? How do we do this? And I don't really have an answer for you. I mean, we rejoice when people rejoice, and we also mourn with people who mourn. But as Christians who hold, again, even when our life is not always good, we have a joy that we hold on to. And part of being a Christian is taking that joy and saying, I need you, I want you to understand this joy because I think you need this in your life. I see and I hear your pain. I see what you're going through. I want to speak this into your life. I want to speak this hope. I want to speak this love. I want to speak this peace. I want to speak this joy into your life. This is part of being a Christian. Again, celebrating what we have, but also being these hands and feet of Christ that take it out into the world. We do it, like we said, rejoicing with those who rejoice. And I like the very last slide. It doesn't super make sense, but I like it. Right? First of all, it's joy from the movie. And if you've never seen these movies, you really need to see both of them. Right? I love it. She's just like, yay! What are we celebrating? Right? She's just joy. And this is part of it. And again, we don't always feel this way, but as Christians, this is what we get to do. We get to come into a world and say, I have something. I don't even know why we're going to celebrate, but let's find a reason to celebrate. Let's find a reason that I can speak joy into your life, that I can, let's look for a way that we can, right? That we can bring joy into your world. Even this Christmas, every Christmas, it was in the email this week, and I know probably 95% of you don't read it. I'd like you to put up your hands if you don't read. No, I'm kidding. I used to do it where I'd put right in the middle, if you read this, you get a donut, and like 6 people would email me back. But in the email this week, what we do every Christmas is we say, hey, if you have a name of someone that you know who is really struggling, someone who is really hurting, someone who could use just a little bit of help at Christmas, we ask you to put that name forward. Then we ask everybody else and you to say, could you also donate some money towards that? And we put all the money together and we take the names. And if depending how many names we get, if we get 10, then we have 10. If we get less, we have less. But we usually take about 10 people, and we take all that money and we divide it amongst those 10 people. And then we tried by the 23rd to get it to them, couple days before Christmas, and we don't have to know them. Often we don't even meet them. We just put it through the door and we say, hey, we write a little note, and it just says somebody at church said your name, knows your name, says you could use some help. And so here's some money just to help you. And that's part of bringing joy, because there's a lot of people who are just even a couple $100 is helpful. It brings a little bit of joy, and this is who we get to be. And I know a lot of you are doing this on your own and doing this in wonderful many ways, but as a church we do this every year. And so the next 2 weeks, next Sunday and the following Sunday, if you have a name of somebody that you can put forward, and then we're going to have like a little box or a thing, or even if you just e-transfer it, just say this is for we don't have names yet, but this is for the Christmas fund, the Christmas drive, because we want to bring some joy into people's lives who need that. So if you know somebody, either email me, write it down, call me, text me, whatever it is, whatever is easier for you to get that name to me. If you know someone who is in need, this week. We want to bring some joy into their life this Christmas. And so this is our question always as Christians. How do we become catalysts for joy? How do we take the joy that we have often in our circumstances, but ultimately that we have in the death and resurrection of Jesus? Why? Because his love has overcome death, which means we what? Right? We have something to look forward to. I'm going to see if this video works, and I'm going to set this up for you. Because this is two people in not a good place. The joy is not in their circumstances. And you may have seen this movie. You may have heard about this movie. I'm not sure. It was kind of a sleeper hit. But it's a scene where they're talking about the joy that goes way deeper than our circumstances. So let's see if it works.
I didn't think it would end this way.
End? No, the journey doesn't end here. Death is just another path. One that we all must take. The grey rain curtain of this world rolls back, and all turns to silver glass. And then you see it.
What? Gandalf. See what?
White shores. And beyond. A far green country. Under a swift sunrise.
Well, that isn't so bad.
No, it isn't.
There you go. It's Christmas. There's elves in it. That's true. That's true. But both, I love that scene, right? Because they're both facing death, and I love the look on his face. I love the look on Gandalf's face as he speaks, and he has so much joy. He speaks with this, just like his eyes are full of light, and he's smiling as he speaks about this hope and this joy that he holds to that their present circumstance cannot take away. I love the Narnia books for the same reason as they speak about, and they have the same sense. There is something they look for that is so much greater. And so whatever this world holds, we have a joy that we hold on to, and I always love that scene. And so I encourage you this Christmas to watch all 12 hours of the movie just for that scene. And that's what I'll leave you with, again, what we want to do as a church, but also individually this Christmas, this Advent season, as we celebrate, as we wait on Christ, on his return. What do we do in the meantime? How can we be catalysts for joy in our neighborhoods, in our homes, and in this world? And so I'll leave you with that. We're going to celebrate communion right now.